You can picture the rifles and muskets used during the American Revolutionary War. You'd think of a small hammer on the side of the rifle that would strike a flint, causing a spark that lit the gunpowder inside, forcing the gun to fire. Matchlocks were similar, but they didn't have the flint. Instead, they had a burning piece of rope that would fall in the powder when the trigger was pulled. So the flintlock takes the matchlock's place in the 1700s. And this becomes fully integrated into military. And you also see a streamlining of military arms. Before, there would be many different types of arms and cannons, but they're streamlined down to a few. So it's not industrialization in the 19th century sense with factories, but it's a streamlining process. And with this change in armaments, tactics also change. Where armies move in lines toward one another, they stop, they fire, they reload. The first line would fire and then drop to one knee and reload while the second line would take aim and fire. And again, get out of your minds where, oh, they were stupid back then. The British didn't understand. You would just be lined up like ducks and then be shot. But Americans created guerrilla warfare. That's why we won. No, James, were they that stupid to just line up and be shot to death?
No, it is not that simple.
Yeah.
I mean, the Americans often use the regular, what we call continental battle style. To many, I mean, Washington, for example, he didn't really he wanted to fight a war just like the British. He wanted to be as British as possible in his fighting style. He just wasn't able to a lot of the time.
Right.
Various circumstances, which we'll get into later. But yeah, it's not as simple as the British just marched along with their bright red coats and all lined up, and the Americans shot at them from the trees. I mean, that did happen some, of course, but not all the time.
Yeah, we'll talk to our bro, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. I'm from Marion County, Iowa, named after him, and I'm from the town of Knoxville, named after General Knox. But the point being that the range of these was quite low, and all of the smoke that would create it would really obscure vision. All that to say, we'll get into more detail, but the formations they used made sense, otherwise they wouldn't do it. With infantrymen firing a single volley, it could mow down a group of advancing soldiers and horsemen. And the place where this absolutely had the most asymmetrical impact was in colonies, where Britain and France and Portugal are going against people really at the Neolithic period in terms of technology in Africa, in islands in Southeast Asia. And with those types of infantry tactics, they can absolutely mow down other enemies. And this is a change with military changes that leads to the growth of superpowers that spread across the globe. And in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, the settlers there are subjected to organized and effective fighters that are trained in these new modern methods with new model armies. So that's one change. The other change, too, changes in government. When we talked about the early modern era, one of the most important characteristics of this period from about the Age of Discovery onward, the 1500s, 1600s, is that unlike the medieval period where you have realms like France, England, and Scotland, now these states have a global character. There's exploration and colonization in the Americas and other places, and areas that had previously been isolated from one another are now in contact with one another. This leads to the Columbian Exchange, the Atlantic economy that causes coffee to go to England and horses to come to the New World and other things like that. So these new economies emerge. They become more sophisticated over the course of the early modern period, where it leads to different forms of economic exchange, and there's the spread of ideas around the world, spread of religion around the world. Christianity has a new missionary impulse at this time period. And one thing that James mentioned was that you don't see industrialization with factories like you would in the 1800s, but one historian used a term to describe, if we're going to describe something that is happening all over planet Earth at this time period, to characterize the early modern period, the term he used was called advanced organic economies. Can you guess what that means, James? What do you think that means?
Advanced organic. So they only used organic farming and methods of raising their vegetables.
Everything is fair trade. Yeah, I mean,
well, actually, that's true because they didn't have all the chemicals we have now. But no, I'm not familiar with that term actually.
Yeah, if you're into clean eating and organic food, it would be paradise back then. You would also die. Yeah. You'd also die of smallpox. Smallpox is also organic, but you take what you get. Advanced organic, that's a term by one historian to mean that with the modern economy with steam engines, with coal power, the ability to harness power to create things vastly beyond human ability is absolutely a tectonic shift in human civilization. Right before that time in the 1700s, we're not quite there, but we're also doing things a little better than we were in the medieval period. We have windmills that are helping harness human energy. Windmills aren't new in this period by any means, but they're a lot more prevalent. You have streamlining of processes, like the creation of weapons, and things are becoming more standardized when it comes to the type of weapons created, for example. Ships are a little bit more standardized. So it's not uniform like things that would come out of a factory, but the projection of human power and the streamlining of how economies work is something that's happening a little different. Okay, so changes in political philosophy and humanity's understanding of itself. We talked a little bit about modernism, that this is something that's starting to take hold in the intellectual class. And when we talk about Jefferson and John Adams and other thinkers, I don't want to suggest that every single person in the American colonies or England is drinking coffee at the salons and talking about Rousseau. I mean, this is not widespread. Most people were just simple church-going Puritans who knew the book The Pilgrim's Progress, and that was about as far as their ideas went. But when we talk about modernity, changes in humanity's understanding of itself, a modern man is an ideal where you see yourself as an intellectual and a moral individual, but you don't just believe in nature and God ordaining all things. Yes, you believe in that. Well, for the most part, there was deists and other figures as well. But you also believe in the findings of experimental science and the desirability of theological and political freedom. You don't want a king who's going to use violence to enforce Protestantism or Catholicism that's leading to all these wars in Europe in the 30 Years' War. So this is the intellectual modernity, but it's different in the 1850s where you have railroads and steam engines and humanity is almost drunk on progress and all the things that it can do. So those are some of the changes happening there. And from what you can see, James, when you were looking at some of these different figures, did you get a sense that they had this idea of progress and enlightenment? Is it uniform across the different founding fathers, or did it change from one to the other?
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
No, I think it is a pretty universal thing. You know, you just think about the reasons why the first colonies, English colonies, were founded in North America. Okay, Virginia, it was a business. They came over to make money. There wasn't a lot of religion involved, but there certainly was not a lot of talking about all men are created equal and the consent of the governed and things like that. You just didn't really see much of that. And you think about the northern colonies, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, they were founded to be a city on a hill, right? They were founded to be a place where, in their thinking at least, God's persecuted people could go and establish a pure church and have a society where God is at the center. There certainly wasn't any idea of religious freedom or democracy. You look at places like Pennsylvania, that was going to be a Quaker haven. Maryland was going to be a place for Catholics where they could worship. So a lot of our earliest colonies, not all certainly, but the earliest colonies were founded for religious reasons. People were very religious back then, but the people that were the founders of the American Republic, not so much. Of course, as you mentioned, some of them were deists. They all believed in God, but they didn't see God as this being who is active in the world and who's, let's say your house gets struck by lightning. The Puritans would have said, oh, it's because you have sinned and God is punishing you. But the people like Washington and Jefferson and James Madison and Franklin and whatnot, they would have said, well, there's electricity in there, especially after Franklin, right? But they would have sought a natural explanation. So yes, there were plenty of devout Christians in the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s, but they tended to be very rationalistic Christians. If Unitarians or deists, or there just weren't a lot of people that we would today call evangelicals or super pious and devout Christians in the sense of they believe every word that the Bible teaches and everything that the church. These are people that questioned authority, and the questioning of religious authority, as we're going to see later, leads to the questioning of political authority.
James, I think I found a way we can start a flame war in the Facebook group and other places where we really get into the religious lives of the founding fathers. That's it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's throw out a statement that they were just deists and Unitarians and whatnot. And we'll get 50 people saying, no, they were devout Christians. Look at this quote. The problem is it's hard to pin down. I don't want to go off on too much of a sidetrack here, but it's hard to pin down their beliefs religiously. They would say one thing in one context to one audience, and then they would say a different thing to a different audience. I mean, I've seen quotations from George Washington where he talks about my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, which that appeals to more conservative evangelical types of people today, and then others where he doesn't, so George Washington usually used the word providence to refer to God, and a lot of people did. And, Jefferson famously in the Declaration of Independence talks about nature's God, or he calls it the creator, but he doesn't say he's the second person of the Trinity, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, things like that. He doesn't quote a lot of scripture. So yeah, that's why I think people see what they want to see in the founders' religious beliefs. But anyway, I don't want to go that's a rabbit trail. And again, we could have a whole series just on that, and it would take us ages to come up with, to do the research, because there's just so much contradiction.
Yeah. I mean, and
one other thing, I'm sorry, Scott, at different times in their lives, they may have believed different things. People's religious beliefs are not static. Mine have not been static. My personal beliefs, which I won't go into, but for example, Alexander Hamilton, I read Cherno's biography of him a while back, and Hamilton was very much of an Enlightenment thinker. I don't want to say a deist necessarily, but he was just not a super religious person when he was a young man. But as he got older, he became more and more devout and more pious and more orthodox, I guess, with a small O. Lincoln was the same way, although Lincoln, of course, is way out of, he's not going to even be born yet when we're done with this series.
It's very tricky to untangle all that. And the society in which they live in, it's very hard not to phrase things in religious terminology, since that's being pumped into the air and water. They would all be culturally Protestant. I mean, there's some exceptions like Charles Carroll, who's Catholic in Maryland, but it's very hard to, you could really if you wanted to isolate things, you can sort of make the founders whatever you want them to. I've heard some say, this is obviously a very fringe belief, that Thomas Jefferson was a Muslim because there's a Quran in his library that was donated to the Library of Congress. And I thought, well, wouldn't an intellectually curious person have a book of one of the great religions of the world? If you're going to really cherry pick things that much, then you can make this think anything you want to. But to circle back to one of the other points, you mentioned how people's views change. Benjamin Franklin, being a deist, he liked practical religion because when he was around deists, he thought all of them were foppish dandies, one of the great insults of the 18th century.
Right.
But that came about on his first trip to England. On his second trip to England, which leads us to our fourth point on changes in British governing policy, he came to England and he was there for about 10 years trying to negotiate on behalf of the colonies. He came a moderate and he left a radical because Britain was so stubborn and obstinate to negotiate with the colonists. And you can't really pinpoint one cause of the American Revolution, but one point, and this comes from a book by Harvard professor Bernard Bailyn in the book The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. One of the causes, there was a belief among colonists that the British government was conspiring to create an autocratic government where the king would have unlimited power. And I'll just quote from the book, two quotes here. One where he says, "There was overwhelming evidence, as a colonist saw it, that they were faced with conspirators against liberty determined at all costs to gain ends which their worlds dissembled. That was signaled to the colonists after 1763, and it was this above all else that the end propelled them into revolution." So when you read founding documents about tyranny and all these things where they make George III sound like an absolutely demonic figure, like Mephistopheles, it's because, true or not, there's an overabiding belief that there's an authoritarian, despotic king who wants to completely strip them of all power whatsoever. And just one other quote from the book about the beliefs and how colonists saw what was happening. The rumor of an Anglican bishop in America was enough to scare the wits